The Subcommittee on Information Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. I appreciate y'all being here. It's great that to finally be here. This hearing has been rescheduled a number of times, and hopefully this is the first of many hearings for this subcommittee on information technology within oversight and government reform. And as we all know, the Oversight Committee exists because of two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient and effective government that works for them. I want to thank all the members for being here this afternoon, and I would especially like to thank the ranking member, Ms. Kelly, for her efforts on behalf of the committee thus far. So thank you. It's been great working with you already and looking forward to the next year and a half. As the chairman of the IT subcommittee, we're looking to do four things over this Congress, excuse me. One of those issues that we're going to be looking at is IT procurement and acquisition. When I was running for Congress, I never thought I'd be talking about IT procurement as much as I do, but this is an important area, an area where we can reduce the size and scope of the federal government. And the second area we'll be looking at is emerging technologies. Our technology landscape is shifting, and with emerging technologies such as drones, 3D printing, these are all things that the government hasn't delved in before. And one, we've got to make sure that we're not stifling any growth in these areas, but are protecting consumers as well. The third area we'll be looking at is privacy. I know we're going to have a conversation today about this issue. When information is becoming increasingly accessible to folks and to the masses, we need to make sure that we're protecting our information. We can protect our digital infrastructure and our civil liberties at the same time, and I'm looking forward to delving in this topic over these next few months. And the fourth area, an area we're going to talk about today, is cybersecurity and information sharing. I think the federal government should be doing everything that it can to share information with the private sector so that the private sector can protect itself. As y'all know, I spent 9 years as an undercover officer in the CIA. My background is in computer science. I may be able to bang out some Fortran 77 code right now, but it's been great having that experience and background and using it to help us as we chart our course forward. I also helped build a cybersecurity company, and one of the things that we'd always tell our clients is that in this day and age, you got to begin with the presumption of breach. If you give me enough time and money, I'm going to get in. And so what do you do to detect someone on your network? How can you contain them and then kick them out? I think this conversation today is pretty timely with the recent attacks on Sony, Anthem, JP Chase, other big names. Just yesterday, we found out about 11 million customers may have had their health records compromised in an attack on Blue Cross that occurred last May. With each passing day and week, there's a new hack, a new breach, or theft being committed over the internet. And because of this, we must encourage the sharing of cyber threat information to help deal with those breaches when they occur. And having been on both the private side and the public side of this issue, I know that both sides are not as communicating as well as they can be. I hope this committee can shine a light on the glaring problem and work with the authorizing committees and the appropriators on bringing forth beneficial cyber legislation. The goal of today's hearing is to paint a picture of common threats, understand how the federal government can better engage with the private sector, and get some suggestions and prescriptive measures that the federal government should take. So again, I want to thank everyone for being here today and participating in this important hearing. And with that, I'd like to now recognize my friend and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Kelly of Illinois, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too look forward to working with you the next year and a half. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on cybersecurity threats faced by the private sector. As you just said, announcements of the attack against Premier Blue Cross were reminded that no company is immune from cyber attacks and data breaches. Sophisticated companies such as Sony Pictures, Home Depot, Target, Anthem, and USIS were all targeted and breached by cyber attackers. The most recent attack against Anthem, one of the nation's leading health insurers, resulted in the theft of up to 80 million personal records of customers and employees. That attack is particularly disturbing because, as I pointed out in an article I wrote in Roll Call last month, medical identity theft represents a new norm in cybercrime. The real victims of cybercrime are the employees and customers whose sensitive personnel information is stolen and used by cyber thieves and other crimes. Cyber theft of Social Security numbers, birth dates, and sensitive medical information puts individuals at heightened risk of crimes such as financial fraud and tax refund fraud. Corporations collect and utilize a lot of personal information about their customers and employees. It is imperative that those businesses employ more effective means to safeguard it. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about best practices they are recommending to help their members protect against cyber attacks and mitigate any damage from data breaches. Today's hearing is also a recognition of the fact that the federal government and private sector must work more effectively together to thwart cybercrime. I also look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about what government can do to help protect businesses and consumers from future cyber attacks and data breaches. It is worth noting that the President recently issued a series of new initiatives to improve cybersecurity information sharing between the government and private sector to better assist in thwarting cyber attacks. And I applaud him for that, but Congress needs to do more. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields the balance of her time, and thank you. I'm going to hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. And now we get to recognize our panel of witnesses. This is a great panel, and this is actually on one of these issues where I think the House, the Senate, and the White House can work together on, and so we're looking forward to that opportunity. Our first witness, and I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Richard Baitlik. He's the Chief Security Strategist at FireEye. Mr. David French, Senior Vice President at the National Retail Federation. Mr. Daniel Nutkiss, Chief Executive Officer at the Health Insurance Trust Alliance. Doug Johnson, Senior Vice President and Chief Advisor of Payments and Security Policy at the American Bankers Association. And Mr. Ed WINSKI, Consumer Program Director and Senior Fellow at the United States Public Interest Research Group. I want to welcome everyone for coming here today, and pursuant to all committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. So if you please stand and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. And with that, Mr. Baitlik, we'll start off with you.
Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm Richard Baitlik, Chief Security Strategist at FireEye. And today I will discuss digital threats, how to think about risk, and some strategies to address these challenges. So who is the threat? In our work, we have discovered and countered nation-state actors from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and other countries. The Chinese and Russians tend to hack for commercial and geopolitical gain, while the Iranians and North Koreans extend these activities to include disruption via denial of service and sabotage using destructive malware. Activity from Syria relates to that region's regional civil war and sometimes affects Western news outlets and other victims. Eastern Europe continues to be a source of criminal operations, and we worry that the conflict between Ukraine and Russia will extend into the digital realm. Threat attribution, or identifying responsibility for a breach, depends on the political stakes surrounding an incident. For high-profile intrusions, such as those in the news over the last few months, attribution has been a priority. National technical means, law enforcement, and counterintelligence can pierce anonymity. Some elements of the private sector have the right experience and evidence to assist with this process. So I like to emphasize that attribution is possible, but it's a function of what is at stake. So who's being breached? In March of 2014, the Washington Post reported that in 2013, federal agents, often the FBI, notified more than 3,000 U.S. companies that their computer systems have been hacked. This count represents clearly identified breach victims, and many were likely compromised more than once. And in the 18 or so years I've been doing this work, this to me is the single best statistic we have, because these weren't attacks, these weren't near misses, these were actual serious breaches that merited a notification by law enforcement. So that gets to the point of, how do victims learn of a breach? Unfortunately, in 70% of cases, someone else, likely the FBI, tells a victim about a serious compromise. That means only 30% of the time do victims identify intrusions on their own. The median amount of time from when an intruder first gets into a company and when the victim learns of a breach, according to our research, is currently 205 days. This number is better than last year's research, where the number was 229 days, but unfortunately, it still means that for about 7 months after gaining entry, intruders are free to roam within victim networks. Well, what are we supposed to do about this? What I like to think of is first defining the risk, and in the case of this hearing, we're thinking about the risk of intrusion to private companies in the United States. There are many other risks we could talk about, but that's the focus of this hearing. So step 2 is try to figure out, are there some ways to measure progress? When I work with companies, what I try to encourage them is to think in terms of a couple metrics. The first one is, how many intrusions are occurring? Because there's many intrusions occurring in companies, but not all of them rise to the level of somebody stealing your data, somebody destroying your data. And then secondly, they need to track the amount of time that elapses from when the intrusion first occurs and when they do something about it. We want to drive both of those numbers down. So some things that can happen outside of companies, though, would impact the threat and the cost to the intrusion. Law enforcement and counterintelligence are the primary means by which you can mitigate the threat. I did an editorial for Brookings recently called Target Malware Kingpins, where I asked, what makes more sense? Expecting 2 billion internet users to adequately secure their personal information, or reducing the threat posed by the approximately 100 malware kingpins in the world? Reducing the cost side of the equation takes a little bit more creativity. One step, and I've noticed it in the testimony of some of my fellow panelists here, is tokenization of payment card data, such that you're not dealing in credit cards when you're trying to authorize transactions. Second step would be to drastically reduce or preferably eliminate the value of a Social Security number. With a Social Security number, as noted in the testimony in more detail by my colleagues, you can get credit reports. It's just an opening to much more damage. So in brief, at least from the perspective of a private company, we can win when we stop intruders from achieving their objectives. It's ideal to prevent an adversary from getting into your network, but that goal is increasingly difficult. So what we need to focus on instead is quickly detecting the intrusion, containing the adversary, and stopping him before he destroys, steals, or whatever it is his mission is there, as Chairman Hurd mentioned. Finally, we must appreciate that the time to find and remove intruders is now. If you were to hire me to be your CSO, the first step I would take would be to hunt for intruders already in your network. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baitlik. And now, Mr. French.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide you with our views on cybersecurity threats facing the private sector, as well as achievable solutions to better protect sensitive information. Retailers are just one of the targets in an evolving and escalating war on our digital economy, and merchants collectively spend billions of dollars safeguarding sensitive customer information. At the outset, let me state that data intrusion is a crime of a particularly international character. In virtually every reported incident, it seems as if the criminals are operating from abroad beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. In all of the congressional scrutiny over data security, there's been a conspicuous lack of attention paid to strengthening our national ability to interdict and prosecute these criminals. We do not have specific recommendations in this area, but this is an observation. It is an observation that this committee is uniquely well situated to conduct such an inquiry. Beyond better law enforcement tools, my remarks center on 3 themes: better payment card security, effective breach notification, and sharing of cyber threat information. In our view, security alone is not the answer. The issue must be considered much more holistically. We must work together to prevent cyber attacks and help reduce fraud or other economic harm that may result when breaches occur. Ultimately, we must make data less valuable. If breaches become less profitable to criminals, then criminals will dedicate fewer resources to committing them, and our common data security goals will become much more achievable. Cyber attacks are a fact of life in the United States, and virtually every network is at risk. In its 2014 Data Breach Investigations Report, Verizon determined that there were more than 63,000 data security incidents reported by industry, educational institutions, and government entities in 2013. Of those, more than 1,300 had confirmed data losses. The financial institutions, the financial industry suffered 34% of these, and the retail industry had less than 11%. I do not cite these figures to criticize our colleagues in the banking industry, but merely to illustrate the fact that the incident of data breaches are proportionate to the relative value of information that can be stolen. It should not be surprising that 3 times more data breaches occur at financial institutions than at retailers. Criminals seek high-value information, and data thieves know that banks carry our most sensitive financial and personal information, including not just card numbers, but bank account numbers, Social Security numbers, and other identified data that can be used to steal identities beyond completing some fraudulent transactions. When it comes to payment card data, there's one single fact that banks and the card networks must acknowledge. All of the decisions about card design and security are theirs alone. Retailers didn't forego chip technology in the U.S. for almost 2 decades, and we didn't conceive of the complex, costly, and largely ineffective payment card industry data security standards. But we have to live with the downstream costs of these decisions every day. Without fraud-prone payment card information in a retailer's system, criminals would not find the rest of the information retailers typically hold, and that is benign data such as phone book information or shoe size or color preference, et cetera, to be all that interesting or, more importantly, lucrative on the black market. That is why payment card security is essential, and the adoption of a microchip in payment cards is a long overdue step in the right direction. For retailers, however, the debate over card security comes down to a basic question about why the card networks and banks continue to rely on signature-based authentication methods rather than the proven security of a 4-digit personal identification number, or PIN. Around the globe, most industrialized nations have adopted PIN-based solutions. We know that PINs provide an extra layer of security against downstream fraud, even if the card numbers are stolen in a breach. In PIN-based transactions, for example, the stored 16 digits from the card would alone be insufficient to conduct a fraudulent transaction in the store without the 4-digit PIN, which is known to the consumer and not present on the card itself. In short, the value of a PIN is hard to question. It's clear to retailers that simple business practice improvements like eliminating signature and adopting PIN would be easier and more quickly implemented than any other steps, and they hold a promise of being more effective at preventing the kind of financial harm that could impact consumers as companies suffer data security breaches affecting payment cards in the future. NRF also commends the President's recent executive order which called for establishing cyber threat information sharing among non-critical infrastructure industries, such as retail, through what are called Information Sharing and Analysis Organizations, or ISAOs. The information sharing groups proposed appear similar to the Information Technology Security Council formed by NRF last year that currently shares cyber threat information among more than 170 information security professionals in retail. More than 2,000 cyber threat alerts have been sent to our retail members since the inception of our program, and we continue to expand its reach among the retail community. Mr. Chairman, the remainder of my comments are in my written remarks. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. French. Mr. Nutkitz, over to you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly. It is a pleasure to join the subcommittee this afternoon to share a high-trust perspective on the cyber threats facing the healthcare industry. While I prepared my written statement for the record, I would like to share with you a few key points. The Health Information Trust Alliance, or HITRUST, was formed in 2007 with a singular mission to streamline the safeguarding of sensitive information, systems, and devices in use within the healthcare system. Our perspective on the evolving cybersecurity threats facing the healthcare industry is formed based on our deep engagement with industry around information protection. That engagement includes data from over 10,000 security systems assessments done in 2014 alone, leveraging the HITRUST CSF. The HITRUST CSF is a scalable, prescriptive, and certifiable risk-based framework developed for and with the healthcare industry, incorporating relevant NIST, ISO, PCI, and other standards, supports various federal and state regulations like HIPAA and HB 300 in Texas, incorporates best practices and lessons learned, including analysis of breach data. It incorporates 135 security controls and 14 privacy controls. It was first released in 2008 and is currently on version 7. And it should also be noted that we identified security controls relevant to cyber threats prior to the release of the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is now fully mapped into the HITRUST CSF. It should also be noted that approximately 85% adoption by hospitals and health plans make it the most widely adopted in the industry. Also influencing our perspective is the HITRUST Cyber Threat Intelligence and Incident Coordination Center, or C3, which is the most active cyber center in healthcare established in 2012. It is a federally recognized ISAO, or Information Sharing and Analysis Organization. It supports threat intelligence sharing and incident coordination for the healthcare industry. It includes threat sharing with the Department of Health and Human Services and Homeland Security. And it has 4 key components. The Cyber Threat Exchange, or CTX, which was created to accelerate the sharing, distribution, and consumption of threat indicators. And it should be noted that the CTX is a revamp of a process that failed, in this case providing indicators of compromise in electronic consumable formats such as STIX, TAXI, and proprietary SIM formats, streamlining the process of making information more consumable. And we make that available free of charge. The second component is something called Healthcare Cyber Vision, which is created to enhance awareness of unknown threats, provide early warning or more prospective view into the unknown cyber threat environment, which provides situational awareness by testing the effectiveness of security defenses against emerging and unknown threats. The third component is something we call CyberRx, which is in its second year, which is a series of cyber preparedness and response exercises to simulate cyber attacks on healthcare organizations. We expanded that significantly this year to include a much larger part of the industry. And the fourth component is our cyber monthly threat briefings. Every month, HITRUST, in conjunction with the Department of Health and Human Services, hosts a cyber threat briefing to help raise awareness and educate the industry relating to cyber threats. Our familiarity and engagement with industry affords us certain insights into cyber preparedness, risk management, and cyber risk indicators that have the potential to impact privacy, disrupt facility operations, or cause direct harm to patients. A few observations. Information protection maturity. In an organization with over 400,000 organizations, ranging from Fortune 15 to solo practitioners, we have a wide range of information security sophistication, which significantly complicates the detection, sharing, and response of any solution or approach. More needs to be done to ensure we are addressing the real needs of the market. Situational awareness. Many organizations don't understand the cyber threats and risks relevant to their organization and spend unnecessary resources and limited resources in tracking things down that aren't relevant. We need to look more at high-tech, low-touch approaches to automate more of the process and make it more actionable for a wider range of organizations. Motives. As to specific motives, many healthcare organizations are a treasure trove for threat actors. They store or process IP, PII, PHI, financial information, medical information, and much of it fully linked together. This makes the industry a high-value target. Threat actors, I think the other panelists have already mentioned this. It's a wide range of actors from nation states to hacktivists of opportunity. And emerging threats. Health plans, most recently, are the target of choice given the magnitude and breadth of information they possess. Hospitals face unique threats given their position of providing care directly to patients and their position of procuring and implementing medical devices and new technologies in their infrastructure. I don't make these statements lightly or with the intention of causing undue harm. As I said before, healthcare is a high-value and target-rich environment. We have come a long way, but still have a long journey ahead of us. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to answer the committee's questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Nutkiss. Mr. Johnson.
Yes, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the subcommittee. My name is Doug Johnson. I'm Senior Vice President of Payments and Cybersecurity Policy at the American Bankers Association. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here today and discuss cybersecurity, as well as representing the ABA. I'm also the Vice Chairman of the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council and on the board of the Financial Service Information Sharing and Analysis Center. The council has been in operation since 2002. The ISAC has been in operation since 1999. So we're fairly mature in terms of our approach to these issues. And I really do appreciate having the opportunity to provide the perspective that we've developed over the years. As the 114th Congress engages in your public debate on the issue of cybersecurity, we share your concerns about the evolving nature of the threats. And we certainly do support effective cybersecurity policy and want to continue to work with Congress toward that. I'm going to focus on three main points as I go through my oral testimony: the evolving nature of the cyber threats, the role of technology in addressing those threats, and then the role of expanded information sharing in protecting against the threats as well, which I think is very important. I think one of the things that is evident is that attacks used to be very singular in focus. There'd be a denial of service attack against a financial institution. There'd be an attack against a merchant's point-of-sale device, or maybe an attempt to destroy or wipe data of an energy company like Saudi Aramco. I think what we've seen now is a set of blended attacks, where these multifaceted attacks create particular challenges for us because essentially they necessitate a simultaneous maintenance of availability, integrity, and confidentiality of data, when formerly a cybersecurity attack would maybe have the impact of one of those data components. And so what that creates is some resource constraints in some instances when you're trying to respond, to those incidents. But what we're also seeing is that attackers of every variety are really becoming increasingly adept at defeating security practices. We've seen the velocity increase with which companies must move so that they can ensure they understand how the cyber risks are changing and what mitigating measures are most effective against those risks. It's an arms race. It really is indeed an arms race. Another increased challenge for institutions in the private sector, and Mr. Nutkus alluded to this, is essentially the voluminous nature of the threat data which we have now. It's not as readily consumable as it could be. And so determining the relevance of a particular piece of threat data, analyzing the magnitude of the threat, evaluating which systems might be impacted, and devising the appropriate course to take in mitigating against the threat it's really becoming increasingly difficult to really accomplish. And again, I will touch on that when we talk about information sharing. And lastly, the victim of the attack is also changing. Prior to 2014, much of the private and public sector energy was focused on critical infrastructure and payments. I think what we've seen based on 2014 is a recognition that there's a broader motivation for attackers in conducting a cyber attack. Essentially, any company in any sector could be subject to a significant and highly visible attack. Technology obviously plays a significant role in protecting our nation's companies and consumers, and my written testimony spends a lot of time discussing that. I would say that the two things that we really focused on in the testimony was really the necessity to get rid of static numbers in the environment. I think one of the things that the President's Cybersecurity Summit demonstrated is that there was a lot of energy around having customers have to essentially remember things in digits and symbols to essentially prove they are who they are. And ways through biometrics and ways through tokenization and other ways to authenticate transactions and individuals are essentially going to be the mechanism by, I think, we really can a much greater impact on the fraud that we're seeing today in the payment space and otherwise. And I do think that from a technology standpoint, the other promising thing is sticks and taxi, which has also been discussed, whereby we're developing a mechanism for even the smallest financial institution, the smallest health company, to be able to consume data and spend more time analyzing that data as opposed to having to make a determination as to whether or not the data even has any meaning in their environment. So those are my oral remarks, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Johnson, thank you very much. Mr. WINSKI, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Kelly and members of the committee. I'm Ed Merzwinski of the U.S. Public Interest Research Group. In my oral remarks, I want to talk about some of the threats that consumers face from the large amount of their information that is floating around in cyberspace and is often obtained by hackers and other people intent on doing evil. I identify in my written testimony 3 levels of breach. The first level is a simple card number breach. A card number breach results in what's called existing account fraud. It's a problem, but consumers are generally well protected by law in the case of existing account fraud. If, of course, your debit card is breached, you do have the additional problem of losing money from your bank account until the bank puts the money back in. That's why consumer advocates recommend the use of credit cards if you can avoid credit card debt. The second level of breach is a breach that also obtains email names, email addresses, telephone numbers, that sort of information that allows the bad guy to conduct what's called phishing, phishing expeditions, to try to obtain additional information about you. And I should point out that after any big breach, it isn't only the serious bad guy that got into your account that conducts phishing expeditions. It's anybody with an email list can then send mail out to people and say, hey, if you're a person who shopped at Target, we need your information. Well, they're not even the guy that has part of your information. They're just another bad guy hoping to capitalize on it. So it's a serious problem. But the third level of breach is the one that results in the motherlode of information being collected that allows worse harm to directly be conducted against you. Phishing expeditions are designed to collect your Social Security number, but the Anthem breach and now the Primera breach resulted in the breach of Social Security numbers, which can be used easily to commit financial identity theft, which is a problem that's been around for 20 years, the additional problem of tax refund identity theft, which has been around fewer years, but is something worthy of the committee's further review and another hearing on probably. Third, medical ID theft, where bad guys get medical attention in your name because they take advantage of your good medical insurance to get their own medical treatment. And then the fourth kind of problem that many consumers have faced over the years, and I've talked to Secret Service agents about this problem, is a bad guy with a bad name wants to use your name to commit crime because you might not be in the system. You don't have 2 strikes against you already. So that can happen to consumers. There are also emotional and other problems that people face from identity theft. What can consumers do? Well, often companies recommend credit monitoring. In the Anthem and the Primera breaches, I say take the credit monitoring. In an existing account breach, it doesn't help. It will not stop identity theft. It's a sop. It's something that will cause you to think you're better protected than you actually are. We recommend any consumer who's not directly in the market for new credit to get a security freeze, and my testimony goes into details on how the security freeze is really the only way to protect your credit report. We recommend to Congress, as committees of jurisdiction consider legislation, don't preempt the states. The states are privacy leaders. Don't impose any sort of harm trigger in any breach legislation. Use an acquisition trigger. If a company loses your information, it shouldn't have the right to decide whether to tell you. It should have its own reputation at risk. Use a broad definition of personally identifiable information in any legislation that goes forward. Most of the bills that I've seen are narrower than state laws. The Attorney General of Illinois has just proposed amendments to their state law, for example, that add geolocational and marketing information to the definition of personal information. As information is no longer just tracked in computers, but tracked on your smartphone, geolocation is very important. As Mr. French talked about, we totally agree with the merchants. Technology neutral performance standard. Chip and PIN is the highest current standard. Why are the banks stopping at chip and signature? It's illogical. Apple Pay and tokenization have some hope, but Apple Pay has been breached in low-tech ways, so a lot more needs to be done there. And then my testimony concludes by going into some detail on the general ecosystem we have today that simply collects too much information, keeps it for too long. Consumers need privacy rights based on a robust code of fair information practices. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Mr. WINSKI, thank you very much. And I now recognize Mr. Walker from North Carolina for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of information and processing here. Very studious work on your parts. I appreciate that. I've got 2 or 3 things that I want to address here, so I may just go between the guys there, so thank you again. Mr. Nickus, let me start with you. I have a lot of family in the healthcare industry, and more of that's becoming technological, whether it's heart monitoring, all kinds of different things. The concerns and challenges facing this industry when addressing cyber threats, is that something that's come across the table as far as discussion? I wanted to know what you guys are hearing on this and just how you would address this. Is it a problem that you're hearing or facing in the medical community?
Cyber threats specific to medical devices?
Correct, yes.
Absolutely. So that has been a long-going issue. We were the first to start tracking vulnerabilities associated with medical devices. We see them on two sides, the implantable and the non-implantable, as well as the control systems that are associated or controlling the devices as well. So ongoing problem. We, at this point, don't track an exorbitant number of threats associated with them, but there's no question we track vulnerabilities.
At some point, is this considered a life and death matter? Could somebody hack a system where they increase the defibrillator or something? Are we at that point to concern about that?
Well, there have been demonstrations where, in fact, that has occurred. The circumstances are very specific. So the answer is absolutely. Okay. The likelihood, based on all the circumstances that would have to occur, but there's no question, this is a concern, disruption of life. One of the things that we do as we look at risk assessments and look at the analysis is we escalate from the PII to the PHI to sensitive health information to other types of information, to disruption of the facility itself, to disruption of care. But it goes beyond the device. You've got electronic health record systems that are used for ordering. So what if people start removing your drug allergies from your systems, and you've got contraindication, and all of a sudden you've got... So I think these are all being worked on. We actually created a new working group specifically to look at this better disclosure and how to move this process along.
Thank you, Mr. Nickus. Mr. Baitlik, you mentioned earlier, I believe you categorized the different cyber attacks. So something like the Chinese and Russians were for maybe financial purposes. Can you go back that process again? I want to make sure that I get that information because you had said some of it financial, some of it's more malicious intent. Would you go back and share that, make sure I've got all that information correct?
Yes, sir. At the top end, the nation-state end, you see the Russians, the Chinese, increasingly now the North Koreans and the Iranians. The problems, though, that you were just talking about with healthcare, that could come from any sector. It could be a criminal element, it could be an activist element, and so forth. And if I could just briefly say that we do have part of an answer to that, and that is in the security community, specifically with the researchers. Part of the problem they're encountering, though, is that some of the research that they do could be construed as hacking and put them at risk of being prosecuted simply for trying to identify these vulnerabilities. Okay. So we need to create a safe space for that sort of good work.
In your opinion, if you're looking at lone wolf, guy in the mom's basement criminal behavior versus some of the international threats, give me a concern overall in your community as far as what we're looking at. Where's the weightedness as far as immediate concern we're seeing?
From the chronic theft of intellectual property, business methods, and that sort of thing, I care about the Chinese the most. If I care about geopolitical problems that could leak from the physical area, then I worry about the Russians and what's going on in Ukraine and them using cyber capability to deter or back up something they're doing physically.
Do you have any numbers as far as how many attacks we might be engaging with or trying to defend off on a daily basis?
The best number I gave, sir, was the 3,000. Those are not trivial hacks caused by someone in a basement. Those are serious intruders that are tracked on a campaign basis by the FBI in the United
Thank you, Mr. Baitlik. Mr. French, my last question before my time expires. You mentioned three things earlier as far as in working to prevent some of this better credit card. You mentioned, can you address some of that? What do you mean by that?
Better payment card security. Okay. The card security choices have been made by the card industry and the banks. Part of it is hardening the card, putting a chip on the card, and that's something that is going on currently. But as Mr. WINSKI noted, the banks are choosing to use chip and signature, not chip and PIN. The only really effective method of authenticating the individual is a PIN. But this also, in a system, it also needs end-to-end encryption as well as tokenization. Ultimately, you want to take the number out of the system so that the number can't be captured and replicated.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. I now recognize the ranking member, Mrs. Kelly from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In a survey of healthcare providers that was published last year, the Ponemon Institute found, and I quote, that 90% of healthcare organizations in the study have had at least one data breach in the past 2 years. Then going to the New York Times article that was published, and I quote, Health organizations like Anthem are likely to be vulnerable targets because they have been slower to adopt measures like keeping personal information in separate databases that can be closed off in an attack. They are generally less secure than financial services companies who have had the same type of customer data. Mr. Nukas, as the CEO of an organization that works with many leading healthcare organizations to improve their data security, what are the most pressing challenges the industry faces when it comes to securing the personal data of its patients from cyber thieves?
So that's a question we deal with all the time. So we have a maturity problem, and we have a resource problem, and I think we've seen the two of them come together. I think we've done a good job in moving the yardsticks with regards to industry's maturity, and we've seen larger organizations implement stronger security controls. I think it's important to note we do this on a risk basis, meaning that we assume that healthcare data is never going to be as well protected as launch codes to a nuclear silo or payloads. So I think there is an expectation that there is always an amount of risk. Certainly, by the way, we can do a much better job. We've tried to do this with education and bringing in tools. One of the things that we are really transitioning from is we have been a compliance-based industry, not a risk-based industry. So our major focus, although we've known for many years that cyber was coming, we had regulations to comply with regards to HIPAA, privacy, and people were really more spending resources on those things because, by the way, the data supported a privacy breach versus a security breach. So where do you spend your resources? You look at the top 10 list, you focus on privacy. I think we've seen this transition very quickly to security, and I think now we're seeing organizations take it seriously. One thing that would certainly help us, and one thing we've looked for, is a degree of safe harbor. You do the right things, you implement the right controls, you go ahead and get management support to get the funding, and when you do that, if something happens, which will happen, by the way, in some cases, you did everything you could. Right now, by the way, organizations look at Anthem and look at other organizations that did extremely well. Let's face it, they were able to detect it themselves, they communicated quickly, they've done a number of things, and they go, well, if Anthem can't protect themselves, we don't have a chance. And I think we're trying to let them know that's not the case. There's a lot that you can do. And as a matter of fact, as those other organizations start to build up stronger security measures, you're going to be a bigger target because you're all that's left.
Would you cite the reasons that you just shared with us, the reasons for the healthcare industry being technologically behind other industries because of where the focus has been and the resources have gone?
I think there's two reasons. One certainly is the resources, no question about it. The other one, I think to some degree is we have a lot of organizations. I mean, we have at least 400,000 that are directly in the industry and some that are single or solo practitioners, 2-doc practices. So I think when you get below the first 50,000 in the industry, you're really talking about very resource challenge. And I think a lot of what we've tried to do is figure out how to move the maturity. Unfortunately, they're all interconnected. So the small docs practice still gets access to the same records that the health plan has or the hospital has, and you end up with a big weak link problem. So we've really tried to move that, but we see it as a resource problem and also a priority problem.
And what would be your key recommendations for improving the apparent security vulnerabilities?
So our recommendations, as we've made, are providing a degree of safe harbor, recognizing that organizations that implement strong security controls get assessed against those controls to demonstrate, in fact, that they are doing everything they can. The state of Texas is a good example. Texas has something called Secure Texas, which if you comply with HB 300 and get certified, you get a degree of liability protection if something happens. Organizations seem to be very receptive and see that as the right way to go get the funding they need. We look at information sharing as certainly a great approach. I think one thing that should be important to note is that to some degree, and look at the Primera breach yesterday or even the Anthem breach, the information that's being shared is quite old. Those breaches occurred in a period of time previously, so information sharing. But also, we are still trying to work with the vendor community. It's a $68 billion market of information security products. We'd like to see them step up a little more as well. The small organizations do not have a chance in being able to affect the same way. I mean, the budgets are not the same, so they're going to have to rely more on existing product.
Indulge me one more question. How can Congress help you? How can we be of assistance?
Well, we certainly would be very, very supportive of things like the safe harbor and giving organizations the ability to do the right things, understand what they are, implement them. We certainly are in favor of information sharing, but again, if you don't have mature organizations, you end up with bad data being shared, which really doesn't help anybody. So what we're hoping is we get the controls in place, people can adopt those controls, which force more mature organizations can more effectively share. I think we've seen a lot of large organizations in industry being willing to share, and we've seen the new bill supporting that. So we think that's moving along. We see liability protection with regards to safe harbors being the way to get the whole process started, because once everybody starts getting more mature, better sharing, less risk, and the whole model comes together.
Thank you so much, and thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
No problem. Now I recognize my colleague, Mrs. Duckworth from Illinois as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to turn the discussion towards the concept of data minimization and data reduction as a security measure. Mr. Baitlik, could you speak a little bit to this principle, and if you think that as a practice, if businesses adopted data minimization, would this type of security measure be more effective in mitigating the damage from a breach?
Yes, ma'am. When you think in terms of risk, you've got threat, vulnerability, and the impact. And to date, most of the focus has been on vulnerability. The problem is vulnerability is everywhere. If we can take steps that make the data less valuable, then if there is a breach and when there's a breach, there won't be that much of an impact. And furthermore, we should look at ways for recovery. In other words, we're looking at what can we do to stop a breach from happening, but we need to look at, well, once the breach has happened, what happens next? Who's responsible for cleaning up the mess of an identity theft? How much does it cost? There's a misalignment of a lot of these issues, so it falls on the consumer and the citizen, and many times they're in the worst position to try to affect change.
Thank you. Can you speak a little bit to the role of encryption in protecting highly sensitive data, especially on business and agencies' networks? This committee's job is to provide oversight of business and government agencies. Can you speak a little bit to encryption? I also sit on armed services and looking at some of their encryption challenges that they have there, especially with a multiple, significant numbers of subcontractors, subcontractors, and the like.
Certainly. So encryption has a value in certain areas. If you're looking at, if I'm going to talk to a colleague at the end of the table, I want to make sure no one in between can hear it, I want to encrypt that data. If I'm carrying around data on a external hard drive or a thumb drive and I lose it in a taxi, I want to make sure that that's encrypted. If I'm doing other sorts of things where encryption stops the intruder from getting access to it. So in certain areas, encryption can be useful, but we have to remember that in order for data to be useful, it has to be read at some point. And encryption won't necessarily be valuable at the point where that data is being used.
Okay, thank you. Sort of following this train of thought, I'd like to then sort of look at data segmentation. Now, we've talked about data minimization, we've talked about encryption. Let's talk a little bit about data segmentation. And Mr. Johnson, can you talk about this as a practice in your industry, and is this considered a best practice, and what would be happening if more businesses chose to do data segmentation?
Sure, I'd be absolutely happy to. I think that it's really system segmentation when you're looking at it, and I think that we've seen a number of breaches both within our industry and in the merchant industry and others where segmentation hasn't occurred, and you've been able to get into a separate system because there was an ability to enter into a different system, an air conditioning vendor in the case of Target, in the case with institution. I know of a Word file going into human resources that ended up compromising an ATM system. And so I think it's very, very important to learn those lessons, that you have segmentation between those systems and only authorized access to data and substantial rights protections associated with who has the right to that data and to view that data and change that data. Mm-hmm. And so I think we spend a lot of time in our industry thinking through that, and our regulatory agencies do as well. One of the major findings that the regulatory agencies came up with, based upon their 500 audits that they did last year of community banks, was that there was actually undue complication within financial systems. There were things that were plugged into other things that didn't need to be plugged in to other things. There were connectivity issues associated with systems. And so one of the charges that we have based on that is to look and make sure that our systems are not unduly complicated so that we don't unduly have data potentially compromised because of that.
Thank you. I just have a minute left. Mr. Baitlik, could you speak a little bit to the cooperation between the Chinese government and their business sector in conducting cyber espionage? Specifically, I'm thinking of the case where it was Chinese companies that infiltrated Lockheed Martin, stole a lot of data, and then shared that data with the Chinese government, which then resulted in them upgrading their fifth-generation fighter jets. But can you talk a little bit about that partnership that seems to be occurring?
Certainly, there's a collaboration among different elements of the Chinese hacking scene. You've got the top-end military units, you've got militia units, quasi-military, and then you've got the patriotic hackers. There's certainly a career progression that people go through. As far as the tasking goes, certainly the military units are tasked to go after private sector companies in the West to steal intellectual property, business methods, and that sort of data.
Thank you.
Thank you. Votes have been called on the floor, but I believe we can make it through questioning so the witnesses won't have to wait around during the vote series. And with that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Mr. Cummings from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief because I know you want to get to your questions. But first of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to welcome you to your chairmanship and to the committee and to certainly our ranking member. I want to thank you and congratulations to both of you. This issue of cybersecurity has been one which I have been trying to raise before this committee for years. And I give credit to you and to Chairman Chaffetz for now addressing it because it's so very, very important. I just have one question. I have a lot, but I want to let the chairman ask his questions. I sit on the Naval Academy Board of Trustees and Board of Visitors, and we understand that cybersecurity is so very important. I mean, we've done a lot to make sure that all of our midshipmen are exposed to cybersecurity education. Do you think that we are preparing, I don't know who's best to answer this, do you think that we are preparing our nation and our young people, and are we preparing the troops to be able to effectively deal with this very, very serious threat to our way of life, to our existence? I mean, and because I wonder sometimes whether, and right now we're dealing, for example, with the Secret Service, and you see situations where people say we're prepared, but then when the rubber comes time, when it comes time for the rubber to meet the road, you discover there's no road. So I'm just wondering, how do you all feel about our colleges and universities and other institutions? Are we where we need to be to effectively deal with this serious problem?
Sir, I can address that. I'm a Air Force Academy class of 1994, and I maintain contact with my colleagues there, and also I've been to beautiful Annapolis. And at the service academies, you do see a very strong focus on cybersecurity. There's contests between the different academies. Outside of that, at the regular universities and such, as my generation moves into teaching, you're seeing more focus on what we've done in corporate America in dealing with intruders, less focus on more abstract topics like cryptography, which has a role, but it isn't the same thing as that rubber meeting the road that you mentioned. So I think that situation is getting better. I'd like to also mention Cyber Patriot. This is a program for middle school and high school students nationwide. In fact, the school where my kids go just won the national championship for the middle school. So there is a focus now. It's both generational and also at different levels of school. So not just at the colleges, but we're seeing that migrate down to the middle schools. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a 1 through 5 program coming up next.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cummings, I appreciate you being here today and appreciate your leadership on this committee. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. And the first question goes to Mr. French, Mr. Nutkiss, and Mr. Johnson. Can you talk to me like the top two biggest digital threats to your industry, to the folks that you represent? The kind of threat actor, you know, that whether it's a country or a specific individual or a person looking for a particular type of information.
From the pattern of breaches that we've seen in recent years, it's organized gangs of criminals using very sophisticated attacks, generally originating in Eastern Europe. I think that's the pattern that we've seen almost in every instance. And unfortunately, they have a very sophisticated method of doing this, and they wipe their tracks when they go in. So it's very difficult. They know what we're looking for, and it's very difficult for us to track them inside our systems and wipe them out.
Mr. Nutkiss?
So I think we see it in two ways. This is assuming, by the way, that we've detected it to begin with in the first place, but I think we found with the Chinese is they are there so long and so stealthy that the damage is substantial. So we find that they, when they get in, you're seeing much larger breaches, or we're not seeing them at all because people they're getting in and out. And then I think we're also seeing then from Russia more financial. So it's there's either some sort of extortion or financial. They're less methodical, so they leave a lot more trails. Those two, for us, are the ones we see the most.
Unfortunately, sir, we see them all. Of course, during the denial of service attacks, those were political, so those were from a nation state. From Chinese, we see the intellectual property thefts. And from the criminals, regardless whether or not they're attacking for economic gain, any set of breached data, it's going to be a bank customer that's at the end of the line for potential financial loss that we end up reimbursing. I think that we see blended threats, as I was talking about during my testimony. The thing that we become increasingly concerned about are threats that have the potential of manipulating or destroying data. And so it becomes, when does data disruption become data destruction, is what we spend a lot of time thinking about in terms of ensuring that we don't have data with the capacity to be manipulated, for instance. I agree that you hear about advanced persistent threats a lot. I think they're more irritating persistent threats. They're IPTs because they don't necessarily have a level of advancement. They just happen to be there for very extended periods of time, over time. One thing we see is a great deal of patience among all these perpetrators.
Excellent. Mr. Baitlik, in your opinion, some of those threats that they just outlined, I know your firm deals with all of the above threats. Is the federal government prepared to help the private industry and private sector in helping them fight these issues?
We've seen, Mr. Chairman, in recent high-profile breaches, the FBI ready to assist. I don't know of their ability to scale, however. I'm not sure if we were to send the Bureau to every one of the breaches that my company is working, whether they would become quickly overwhelmed. And that's one of the areas where this is different than a physical situation where you can call your local police and they're usually equipped to help you. We don't yet have a scalable government response to the problem.
And to Mr. French, Nutkiss, and Johnson, and very quickly, in what ways can the government better provide information to you, or what type of information should the government be providing to you to help protect your industry and the folks you represent?
The government can do two things, in our opinion. First of all, better cyber sharing legislation would help to facilitate more real-time exchange of information so that parties within the economy would be sharing with each other. The government has, through many of their systems, whether it's U.S. CERT or the Secret Service or FBI, done a very good job of working with, for example, Mr. Johnson's FSI-SAC, and the FSI-SAC is a very sophisticated means of flowing that information out. They use a traffic light protocol that shares that information with parties and partners in the industry, including retailers. So the information flow is there, but we could use some cybersecurity legislation.
Mr. Nuckless, briefly.
So I think for us, it's the format of the information. I think we'd like more information that's more valuable, accurate information, and we'd like it in a format that we can consume quickly. There's a lot of work involved, and a lot of it is information. You know, the analogy I use is Amazon online, Hulu Plus, and Netflix. We're getting the same information over and over again. We just really want the stuff we want. So specify what's really important, because if you end up with too much information, people get distracted. So we need good information, and we need it in a format that we can distribute it quickly.
Mr. Johnson, you have 30 seconds.
Well, first of all, let the record show that I completely agree with Mr. French on this issue regarding information sharing. But secondly, I think liability protection is the other piece of that, because we need clarity in terms of what that liability protection for voluntarily sharing information is, and recognizing that proper privacy protections need to be in place and that data needs to be minimized. But I think that would greatly enhance the ability of us to have more adequate information sharing across sector particularly.
I'd like to recognize Ms. Kelly for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Mrzinski, since not everyone is familiar with the crime of medical identity theft, can you explain for us what it is and how it occurs, and then what type of personal information do cyber thieves target when they commit medical identity theft?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. And the medical identity theft is a relatively newly identified problem. The World Privacy Forum has issued several reports on it. And essentially, instead of opening bank accounts in your name, somebody obtains medical services in your name. They may not be able to afford health insurance, but they use your health insurance to get the services that they can't afford.
Okay.
It's a very, very significant problem. And again, for the first time, we understand that the Anthem breach did not include medical service information, but the Primera breach may have. The Anthem breach, however, provided enough information to commit all the other kinds of identity theft and possibly to apply for health insurance in your name.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
And gentlemen, I wish we had 2 or 3 more hours to continue this conversation. This is an important topic and something that I'm looking forward to working alongside the Ranking Member Kelly on this issue. I really appreciate y'all taking the time to appear to us today. The materials you provide in advance were incredibly helpful as well. I'm looking forward to following up with each one of y'all individually on that as we chart a course on making sure that the federal government is doing absolutely everything we can to protect our consumers and to protect our industries from those that are trying to do us ill. There's no further business. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.